Obviously, any tariffs are concerning, and we're working hard with the industries and sectors likely to be impacted. None of them want to see a trade war, which is why we're engaged in discussions with the United States about mitigating the impact of tariffs. Now, that's what we're working hard on. But in answer to your question, yes, in the end, our national interest has to come first, which means all options are on the table.
Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, found himself facing a significant diplomatic setback when his efforts to avoid a looming economic crisis were swiftly dismissed by former President Donald Trump. This failure, which would send ripples through the political landscape, was a crushing blow to Starmer's government. His attempt to mitigate the devastating impact of Trump's newly imposed tariffs on British exports failed catastrophically, leaving Starmer's administration in disarray. The timing of this diplomatic failure couldn't have been more damaging, as it occurred at a time when Starmer's government was already under attack for its increasingly controversial stance on free speech. This diplomatic insult only intensified the pressure, plunging the Labour government into deeper trouble. Starmer, fully aware of the grave economic consequences posed by the tariffs, quietly reached out to Trump, hoping to negotiate a delay in the implementation of the sanctions. However, the British Prime Minister's communication with Trump was far from a strategic diplomatic initiative. Instead, it resembled a desperate plea for a reprieve. Starmer had hoped that by establishing some rapport with the former president, he could secure a delay and protect the UK from the economic fallout. Unfortunately, Trump's response was nothing short of a diplomatic slap in the face. Rather than offering any real concession, Trump reportedly said, "I'll look into it," offering no definitive commitment or assurances. What was meant to be a serious negotiation turned into a humiliating dead end for Starmer. Trump's response wasn't just a simple rejection, it was a public rebuke of Starmer's efforts, leaving him with nothing to show for his outreach. There was no formal request for an exemption from the tariffs, no concrete proposals put forward. This failure highlighted the fragile nature of international diplomacy, where a single misstep can have far-reaching consequences. For Starmer, already struggling to maintain control over his government's increasingly unpopular policies, particularly regarding freedom of speech, this diplomatic failure was a disastrous blow. To make matters worse, this diplomatic setback came just as Starmer's government was being heavily criticized for suppressing fundamental freedoms. As his outreach to Trump fizzled out, so did any hope of mitigating the economic damage of the tariffs. What was once an attempt to safeguard Britain's economic interests turned into a glaring example of political weakness. The inability to secure any form of relief left Starmer's opponents seizing the opportunity to further highlight his government's ineffectiveness. In a matter of days, Starmer had gone from trying to safeguard the UK's economic future to becoming the subject of ridicule on the global stage. The looming spectre of tariffs was not merely an economic challenge for the United Kingdom, it was a catastrophic threat that could cripple essential industries. Yet Prime Minister Keir Starmer's administration appeared woefully unprepared for the looming crisis. The United States Liberation Day tariff initiative, slated to begin on April 2nd, promised to impose sweeping new duties on foreign exports, including goods from the UK. As the clock ticked down, the UK's prospects of avoiding economic disaster seemed increasingly slim. In the face of this looming crisis, Starmer had hoped to secure some form of diplomatic relief from former President Trump, with the hope of negotiating a trade deal that could mitigate the impact of the tariffs. But Starmer's attempt to navigate this perilous situation ended in a diplomatic fiasco. Starmer's strategy had hinged on securing a focused trade agreement with the US, specifically one that would grant an exemption to the UK's crucial tech sector. With the tariffs threatening to disrupt key industries, the Labour government believed that Trump, a seasoned negotiator, might be open to a discussion that could help alleviate the economic blow. However, the reality proved far more disappointing. Rather than engaging in a high-level diplomatic exchange, Starmer's outreach to Trump devolved into a desperate plea for mercy. Sources indicated that Starmer even invited Trump to London in June, offering a platform for a potential deal signing in person, but Trump declined. Instead of meaningful dialogue, the former president offered a dismissive, "I'll look into it," leaving Starmer to face the growing storm back home. What was intended to be a calculated maneuver to secure an economic lifeline turned into a public embarrassment. Starmer's failure to present a formal request for an exemption, combined with the reports suggesting that his plea was little more than a desperate ask for more time, exposed the weakness of the British government's position. This diplomatic misstep only underscored the government's inability to effectively handle such a high-stakes negotiation. As a result, the UK was left exposed, vulnerable to the full economic force of Trump's tariffs, without any substantive plan to mitigate the damage. Following this debacle, Starmer and his team scrambled to find alternative solutions, but the lack of a clear strategy left them floundering. The prospect of retaliatory tariffs loomed ominously, and there seemed to be no clear path forward. The situation was a painful reminder that in the volatile world of international diplomacy, a single misstep can have far-reaching consequences, potentially costing a nation dearly. Keir Starmer's government faced an alarming new wave of international condemnation, this time concerning its increasingly contentious stance on free speech. The case of Livia Tichy-Bolt, a 64-year-old retired scientist, became a focal point of this growing criticism, attracting the attention of human rights advocates around the world, including the US government. Bolt had been charged for peacefully holding a sign outside an abortion clinic that simply read, "Here to talk if you want." Her act, which was non-confrontational and intended only to invite conversation, violated a local public spaces protection order designed to create buffer zones around clinics. This seemingly benign gesture led to her prosecution, and while the case itself may have been small in scope, it reflected the wider issue of rising concerns about freedom of expression in the UK. The timing of this event was disastrous for Starmer, who was already reeling from a diplomatic setback following his failed negotiations with Trump over looming tariffs. Just as his government struggled with the fallout from those trade talks, a human rights crisis erupted on the home front, threatening to further damage his credibility. The US State Department issued a rare sharp rebuke, publicly criticizing the UK's treatment of Bolt as a symbol of the erosion of free speech. The statement went beyond merely addressing the case itself. It was a warning that the UK risked alienating its closest allies if it continued down this path of suppressing fundamental freedoms. This international backlash was exacerbated by the British government's inadequate response. Instead of defending free speech as a fundamental value, the Labour Party found itself on the defensive, struggling to explain its stance. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds tried to downplay the situation, claiming that the UK's approach was calm-headed and that a reversal of tariffs might still be possible. However, this response did little to reassure either the public or international observers. Instead of standing firm on core principles, the government appeared to retreat, prioritizing economic concerns over human rights, thus exposing a profound contradiction. While Labour worked tirelessly to secure international trade deals, it seemed to be undermining the freedoms the UK had long been admired for. As the backlash intensified, the UK's image continued to weaken. What began as a minor legal issue for Livia Tichy-Bolt quickly morphed into a symbol of the UK's potential slide into censorship. With the US government now scrutinizing the UK's human rights record, Starmer's leadership was under a microscope. Critics began to argue that the pursuit of economic survival could not come at the cost of basic freedoms. The situation evolved into a diplomatic nightmare, one that threatened not only the UK's relationships with its allies, but also exposed serious flaws in the Labour government's commitment to safeguarding the rights of its citizens. Amid growing international backlash over free speech and the economic damage inflicted by Trump's trade policies, Keir Starmer's Labour government found itself in an even more vulnerable position. Its response to the mounting criticism was tepid and unconvincing, failing to effectively address the concerns. Instead of standing firm in defense of the fundamental right to free expression, Labour chose to reinforce its controversial stance, further alienating both domestic and international critics. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds attempted to calm the situation, reassuring the public that the government was taking a calm-headed approach to the matter. However, his reassurances fell on deaf ears, providing little comfort to those increasingly concerned about the erosion of civil liberties. His attempts to downplay the situation and avoid confrontation only underscored the government's inability to engage seriously with the issue. What made the situation even more troubling for Starmer and his government was their failure to present a clear and actionable plan to address the concerns raised by the US State Department and other global observers. While Reynolds spoke vaguely of the possibility of reversing tariffs in the future, he failed to offer any concrete steps or guarantees. This lack of a defined strategy left both the public and the international community uncertain about the government's intentions and ability to act. The suggestion that a solution might come in weeks or months was hardly a reassuring response to an issue that demanded urgent attention. Rather than taking decisive action to defend free speech, the government appeared content to wait passively for an opportunity to change its course. A strategy that seemed more like wishful thinking than practical policymaking. The contradiction between the government's approach to trade negotiations and its handling of free speech was stark. On one side, Starmer's government was bending over backward to secure economic deals with the United States, even going so far as to beg Trump for more time. On the other, when it came to defending the fundamental rights of its own citizens, the Labour government seemed indifferent, allowing critical issues like freedom of expression to fester without intervention. This glaring inconsistency only served to reinforce the perception that Starmer's priorities were out of sync. It seemed the government was more focused on avoiding the economic fallout of Trump's tariffs than on upholding the democratic values of freedom and justice that the UK had long championed. In the end, Starmer's failure to address the free speech crisis left his government open to increasing criticism, both at home and abroad. As the Labour government struggled to formulate a meaningful response to the international outcry, its position weakened further. Rather than upholding freedom of expression, the government found itself on the defensive, unable to act with clarity or conviction. The damage to Starmer's credibility was done, and the looming question was whether his government could recover from this dual crisis, economic and moral, or if it would continue to flounder under the weight of its own contradictions. As the UK found itself caught in the middle of a diplomatic turmoil and a growing human rights debate, the economic consequences of the situation grew ever more severe, particularly with the looming tariffs. The increasing strain between Keir Starmer's Labour government and its international allies highlighted the real possibility of the UK facing isolation both economically and ideologically. With Trump's Liberation Day tariffs set to begin on April 2nd, the crisis shifted from a diplomatic misstep to a full-blown threat that could unravel the UK's economic stability. Starmer's attempts to mitigate the impact through negotiations seemed increasingly futile, especially after Trump's outright dismissal of his plea, exposing the UK's diplomatic and political fragility. For Starmer and his government, the inability to secure an exemption or delay on the tariffs was a turning point. Already struggling to maintain control domestically, Starmer found himself facing a delicate balancing act. On one hand, there was the urgent need to shield British industries, particularly the tech sector, from the devastating economic fallout of the tariffs. On the other hand, the escalating concerns over the UK's stance on free speech, intensified by sharp rebukes from the United States and global human rights organizations, loomed large. What had initially been seen as a potential lifeline through trade negotiations with Trump quickly turned into a source of embarrassment, further complicating the government's already vulnerable position. This sense of isolation was felt both within the UK and internationally. On the global stage, the UK's approach to free speech was under intense scrutiny, with Washington's condemnation serving as a glaring reminder of the need to balance fundamental rights with economic priorities. At home, Starmer's government faced mounting pressure as critics increasingly argued that the Labour Party was willing to sacrifice core values in exchange for temporary economic gains. The combination of international dissatisfaction and the UK's struggles to secure a viable trade deal created a political storm that only served to further isolate Starmer's administration. Domestically, the British public's confidence in Starmer's leadership continued to diminish. With the failure to secure a favourable deal on tariffs and the lackluster response to growing concerns about free speech, many began to question the government's ability to effectively lead. In this fragile moment, it became increasingly clear that the UK's standing on the world stage was uncertain. As the deadline for Trump's tariffs loomed, the Labour government found itself running out of time and options. The question now was whether Starmer could navigate the escalating crisis, or if the UK would be left to face the economic and ideological storm on its own. The political fallout from Keir Starmer's failed diplomatic efforts, combined with growing concerns over the suppression of free speech, painted a bleak future for his government. With strained diplomatic relations and public confidence dwindling, Starmer found himself at a pivotal moment. The question now was whether his government could recover from the double crisis, economic and moral, that it faced. The failed attempt to delay Trump's tariffs highlighted the government's vulnerability in international negotiations, as what initially seemed like an opportunity to secure a trade concession turned into a humiliating failure. With the tariffs set to take effect, the UK was on the brink of economic isolation, while Starmer's handling of free speech issues revealed deep flaws in his administration's domestic policies. The Labour Party's refusal to take a firm stance on basic freedoms only intensified perceptions of weakness, both within the UK and abroad. As the situation evolved, it became clear that Starmer's leadership was under intense scrutiny. His inability to address crucial issues with the clarity and decisiveness expected from a leader left him open to criticism from both his political opponents and the international community. The failure to protect fundamental rights and secure key economic concessions placed Starmer in a precarious position. Whether he could regain public trust, navigate the economic turbulence, and restore the UK standing on the world stage remained uncertain. The stakes were incredibly high, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted on Starmer to prove his ability to lead effectively. His administration now faced an existential test: whether it could overcome the mounting challenges, or whether the damage was irreparable. Starmer had to demonstrate that he could weather this storm, or risk seeing the collapse of both his political credibility and the Labour Party's future. The coming weeks would be crucial in determining the fate of Starmer's leadership and the UK's direction. As the country grappled with both internal and external crises, the question remained: could Starmer rise to the occasion, or was the situation too dire to recover from? See you soon.